Hello, everyone. So for the microevolution topic, I liked the breaking down into a few sections. So we're going to do that for this week as well with macroevolution. So we're going to talk about what macroevolution is, first of all. We're going to talk about the different types of evidence for macroevolution. So that's all going to be this first video. Then we're going to talk about what speciation is. So what a species is and what speciation is. And you're like, I don't know, what is that? We'll get to that. Okay. And then the last one is going to be a little bit of kind of a conversation about like how we name species and how we think about how species are related to each other and all of that kind of stuff. So yeah, so that's the plan. So it's going to be another set of 3. Okay. It's not always going to be a set of 3. It just so happens that that makes sense for this. Okay, so macroevolution. Let's jump in here. Let's jump in. I sound like a YouTuber. So macroevolution, macro is essentially the opposite of micro. So micro means small, macro means big. So what is macroevolution? I mentioned before that one of the things that I don't really like about your textbook, the way that it organizes this material, it doesn't present any of it incorrectly as far as I'm concerned. But I don't like the way that they organize it because they kind of are flip-flopping between the type of evolution that you can see on a small scale, in some cases extraordinarily rapidly, and they're kind of blending that in with evolution that happens on a much larger scale and can happen pretty rapidly, but also can take tremendously long periods of time as well. So that's why I like to separate them. So this little diagram kind of gives you that idea. It's saying, all right, microevolution is when you have a change in allele frequencies over a couple of generations within a population, right? So remember that a population is a bunch of individual organisms within the same species that interact with each other. And so when we're talking about allele frequencies, remember we're talking about genes essentially. And so we're looking at how frequencies or percentages of genes change within just a single population, often over only a couple of generations. So depending on how long the generation time is, that can be a really short period of time. Okay, so we covered that last week, so we're done with that for now, unless you have questions. Macroevolution is where we're talking about like history of the earth level change. Okay, so much longer periods of time. All right, so that's what we're doing. Okay, and so what we're going to do, like I said, is first we're going to talk about all the different types of evidence that we have for macroevolution. So one of the themes that we've been talking about since the beginning, since the first week, is this idea of what science and what is not science, what constitutes good science, right, as opposed to pseudoscience. How does the word theory differ in science versus in what you say to your friends? I have a theory. I think she's cheating on him, and that's why she's doing XYZ, right? Okay. So what does the word theory mean in biology? And so I'm not going to repeat it. I'm going to suggest to you that if you're not clear, if you couldn't give me a list of like between 3 and 5 things that have to be met in order for you to consider an idea to be a theory in science, you need to go back to chapter 1 and review that. So either the book or the lecture, right? Either way, you can get that information. But you need to make sure you're really clear on that. And so, because a lot of people have this misunderstanding that theory means like, oh, it's a hunch. It's just somebody's, like, it's a hunch. And this is not that, not at all, okay? To give you an example of another very sort of tangible example of a theory is gravity. Gravity is a theory, right? And yet you live your entire life not questioning, is gravity going to happen, right? Like, if I get out of bed today, am I going to just start floating? No, because gravity has tons of evidence to support it. It's unlikely to change, yada, yada. Okay, sorry for the tangent, but that's important, okay? So we're going to discuss 4 major categories of evidence for macroevolution. And some of these lines of evidence we've known about forever, and some of them are a little newer, but most of them, you know, have been around for decades and decades and decades as far as like human understanding of them. Okay, so number 1, our first line of evidence is the fossil record. And so, you know, I think most people have a pretty good feel for this, so I'm not going to talk about it too much, but the idea that occasionally when organisms die, rather than decomposing, they find themselves in circumstances where their bodies are preserved, right? So, you know, a clam, it's clam here, it's clam. Okay, clam dies, right? And it ends up, you know, dumping into a like shallow sea, right? Maybe it was from a lake that traveled through a river and ends up in a shallow sea, and you know, and there's a bunch of erosion, and so sediment covers it up, and if that sediment covers it quickly enough, it could make it an oxygen-free environment, which would prevent it from decomposing normally, right? And it sort of gets trapped, and then over time it becomes mineralized, and it doesn't disappear. And that's how fossils are made, okay? Now, an important thing to realize about fossils, well, there's a couple important things to realize. One is not everything that dies gets fossilized, right? It's actually an incredibly rare occurrence, as it turns out. So sort of by definition, the fossil record, right, which fossils we are able to find, is incomplete, because we don't have fossils of everything, because most organisms decompose, okay? Another thing you need to know about fossils is that we can figure out relative age. And when I say relative age, I mean like this thing is older than this thing, or this thing is younger than that thing. Okay, so not absolute age, not this is exactly, you know, 12,342 years and 3 months old, right? I mean relative age, so you're older than you. By where we find fossils, right? So in general, older fossils are deeper underground, right? Younger fossils are closer to the top, right? Because the way that they settle and sediment falls on top of them, okay? There's always exceptions to everything, but that's sort of a general thing, okay? So this is a kind of cheater, superficial way of talking about how fossils are formed, right? And this is the picture from your book. So this is like this is the old picture, new picture, same idea. This, actually, I like this one a little bit better, but I liked this one because it shows the steps. This one doesn't show the steps, but anyway, but it has cooler looking fossils, so whatever. Anyway, okay? All right. What constitutes a fossil? Well, any physical evidence of life that is left behind after that organism dies is a fossil, right? So most of the time when we think of fossils, we think of hard structures like bones or shells or teeth, right? We think of things that are really hard like that. And the reason we think that is because bones and teeth and shells and things like that are more likely to fossilize than like soft tissues. So imagine a slug, right? Or like a jellyfish. Those in general don't fossilize very well because they decompose typically very fast because they don't have any like tough, hard structures in their bodies, okay? Now we do have fossils of all kinds of weird soft-bodied things, but they're just not as abundant, okay? One thing that a lot of people don't think about is they don't think about the fact that we have a lot of fossils of plants too. Everything from petrified wood, so this is wood where minerals have seeped into the wood and essentially turned it to stone. That's what petrified wood is. Or imprints of leaves, that's what this is. We have fossils of pollen. Pollen is so tiny you have to use a microscope to find it, but that exists too. That's one of the things that they actually excavate in the La Brea tar pits in LA, right? Is they're looking at not just all the big cool animals that were once, you know, in Los Angeles, like, you know, giant sloths and, you know, saber-toothed cats and all that like cool crap, right? Dire wolves and, you know, but also what kind of plants were growing there then. And they can actually sift through the tar right? And find pollen. Okay, so plant material can be fossilized as well. And last time I talked about the OG Jurassic Park, if you remember that, right? If plant material or animal material gets trapped in sap, and then that sap experiences a lot of pressure, the sap can turn to amber and enclose entire organisms, right? And here's a picture of a dude looking at footprints, right? So even footprints count as fossils because they're evidence of a living thing, right? So footprints, slither marks, like as something slithered around on the ground, or even like imprints of something. Okay. So all different, so many different kinds of things can constitute fossils. Okay. Typically the easiest way to see fossils is when you see areas that have experienced geologic activity, right? So sedimentary rock builds up over a period of time and then water cuts it away, right? So erosion is amazingly powerful. And if you've never been to the Grand Canyon or any of the big impressive canyons in the Western US, it's really, I mean, a picture, it's like, oh yeah, that looks really cool. It's so different when you're actually looking at it, especially when you think about the fact that the way that all of that rock was carved was just by water, just trickling through and just, creating erosion and breaking out little bits of rock. And yeah, it's pretty amazing, right? It's really like awe-inspiring when you think about it. And so this is places like this where you have different ages of rock that are exposed are easy to find fossils of different ages. Okay. Like I said a minute ago, the fossil record is it's not complete because not everything fossilizes. Some groups are better represented than others. So it turns out that we have a pretty good record of all of the ancestors of horses, right? So modern horses all the way back to the first horse-like critters, right? And it just so happens that we have examples of fossils kind of like every little step away, right? Of the way, I should say, right? Not all lineages of organisms are like that. Some are, it's really exciting when people find intermediates. Okay, so Basilosaurus is it's actually a mammal. I know it says saurus in its name. It's not a saur. It's not a lizard, right? It's not a dinosaur. But this is an ancient whale relative, believe it or not. Okay, and so whales are actually pretty close. So I don't want to give this away because you're going to be doing a lab this week on this particular topic on whales. Okay, so I don't want to give it away, but I will say that whales evolved from animals on land, right? From mammals that lived on land that walked around on four legs. Modern whales don't have any, they don't really, they have this little tiny like remnant of a pelvis, but they don't have any hind legs or hind flippers. They do still have their front flippers, right? But they don't have they don't have a pelvis, or, well, they, like I said, a little bit of a pelvis, but they don't have any flippers in the back. Because that produces drag, right? And so, those disappeared when they moved to having a fully aquatic life. And so we actually have all kinds of intermediates, right? So we know how whales evolved from a variety of different ways, one of which is by looking at the fossil record and seeing these kind of intermediate steps that are going, over time, right? It's like you're looking back into history, right? It's like, oh, here's when they lost their, hind legs. Here's, blah, 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 right? And you can kind of see, here's when their overall body shape was changing a little, right? And so you can essentially rewind and look at what they have looked like, because we have a pretty good record of those guys, right? So here's the images, right? So the oldest ancestor of whales was like a weird, creepy carnivore, kind of looked like a cross between like a dog and some sort of like scary rat thing. I don't know, right? Yeah, and so we can see these intermediate forms get more and more and more and more and more and more aquatic until the point where they completely don't have any of these leg bones anymore, right? It's just the pelvis that's left. Okay, so when you're doing your lab this week, this is another one that's kind of like a virtual type of thing. I promise we'll get back to doing more hands-on labs. I know, we just had Alka-Seltzer a couple weeks ago, but we will have more hands-on labs, but this is another one that's kind of, a little bit kind of simulation. Anyway, so you might want to refer back to this, okay? One of my favorite stories of a fossil that tells an important story is an organism that has been named Tiktaalik. And so in your homework, there's a video about this, a guy named Neil Shubin, who him and, some of his homies found the missing link between fish and amphibians. And that's amazing because it was within less than it was after 2000. I can't remember the exact year. I should, but I can't. So it's recent, right? And when they found it, it was a really, really big deal because biologists knew, based on looking at all kinds of other evidence, that there must have been a connection between fish and amphibians, but they didn't have like this perfect intermediate step in the fossil record until Shubin and his team found Tiktaalik. So like I said, there's a video about this in your homework. It's a really fascinating story. If anybody wants to know more about it, I could talk about Neil all day long, especially so he's a paleontologist at the University of Chicago, and he also works at the Field Museum. And the Field Museum is a natural history museum. It's a super old, super cool natural history museum in Chicago. And depending on when you're watching this video, a couple Mays ago, I got to go to a conference, and I got to go to the Field Museum and see the behind the scenes part of the Field Museum. And it was like, I was like fangirling. I was like, Neil Shubin's been here. Oh my gosh, I'm gonna get to like see stuff that he's like touched. Oh my God. Anyway, sorry. Anyway, he wrote a book. He's written a couple books. He's awesome. So even when we don't have these so-called missing links, right? Sometimes we find them. But even if we don't have them, remember, fossil evidence is only one type of evidence. Okay? All right. So a little bit about the ages of fossils. So I don't want to get into the weeds of this too much because it's a really kind of technical process. I'm going to have you guys watch a little video about it just because you can watch somebody else talk about it. So there's going to be a little YouTube video to help you understand carbon dating and radiometric dating. Essentially, the idea is this. Some compounds, some atoms, some elements have isotopes that are radioactive. And what that means is that they're unstable and they break down and they spew energy. And they do it at an extraordinarily predictable rate. So we know exactly how quickly that process occurs. And so if you measure the amount of one of these radioactive isotopes in an item, right, you can know exactly when that critter died, right? Because you can look at what percentage of carbon, for example, is carbon-14 as opposed to carbon-12, which is the non-radioactive type. Okay, so like I said, I don't want to bore you too much with the details, but do watch the video because the guy in the little YouTube video explains it pretty well. One thing I do want to mention though is I want to talk a little bit. So this is how we give ages to things, radiometric dating. But this is a big but. Even before we had this technology, and it's been around a long time now. It's been around, a few decades by now. But even before we had the ability to do radiometric dating, we had the, techniques and instrumentation necessary to do it. we had a time scale. Let's call it a time scale. Some people call it the geologic time scale, right? So the time scale of how old the Earth is, okay? And if you look at a geologic time scale, I don't even think there is one in your book, probably because they're trying not to overwhelm you, okay? You don't need to memorize any of this though, okay? I'm just showing it to you so that if you're curious, you can kind of, you know, you can kind of look around. So this time scale now, oh crap, what did I just do? This time scale, oh, there we go, has ages associated with it, okay? But before we had a really accurate method of figuring out how old things were, we still had a scale, because remember that fossils are found in layers, right? So things that are deeper in the ground are older than, you know, things that are shallower, that are closer to the surface, right? So even before we had a way of saying, okay, that was, you know, 70, that little area is 70 million years old, okay? Even before we could put dates on things, we could see patterns, right? Of there's this layer and it tends to have this kind of organisms. And then there's this layer and that layer typically has this kind of organism, right? And so we have these layers, and those layers are called eras, periods, epochs, depending on, you know, and you don't need to memorize any of this, any of it, okay? But even before we had good dating, we had this kind of a thing. So when somebody talks to you about like, and this dinosaur was active during the Jurassic period, right? Essentially what that means is that before anybody knew how long ago the Jurassic period was, turns out it was between 144 and 206 million years ago. But before we knew the dates, we knew, oh, there's this sort of group of organisms that were dominant at this particular time. Okay, now you will notice that this time scale is not like an even scale, right? It's not like every 10 million years we call that a new time period. So why wouldn't it be? That would be so much easier, right? Like if it was like a ruler, if it was like, and here's, you know, 10 million years, 20, 30, 40, right? If it was an even scale, that would be so much easier to learn and think about and all of that. So why isn't it that way? Well, it has to do with the way that the scale was developed, right? And so essentially the boundaries between these different time periods are boundaries that represent big changes. Okay, so what do I mean by big changes? I mean, all of a sudden, right, you have these rocks that don't really have much of anything interesting in them at all, to all of a sudden you hit a layer of rock and it's got all kinds of stuff. Okay, and so we call that a radiation. And this particular one is called the Cambrian explosion, right? Because all of a sudden there's this really rapid, relatively speaking, development of all different body forms and all different kinds of organisms. And it's really amazing, okay? Other times, a big event could be an extinction, right? So let's talk about everybody's favorite. This is not the biggest extinction, by the way. It's just the one that everybody is most familiar with. Okay, so notice that even the table changes color, right? It's like, well, we were in the Mesozoic, and now we're in the Cenozoic. Don't memorize any of those names, okay? So 65 million years ago, some stuff went down. Some major stuff. Okay, and that major stuff, what it turns out that it was, is a rather large asteroid hit the Earth in what is now known as the Yucatan Peninsula, right? So here's a little picture that shows where the crater is. You can actually see, like in satellite images, you can see the crater. So we know how big the asteroid was that hit, right? And we can look at the age of the rocks, right, to figure out how old, right, how long ago this happened, okay? And so the idea of that extinction, right, the story of that extinction. And so what happened in that extinction? Is it a theory? Is she about to tell us about a theory? Not really, because remember that theories are things that have tons and tons and tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of evidence and are very broad in scope. Okay, so we might then say that the hypothesis, now it's an extraordinarily well supported hypothesis, it's a hypothesis that most people think is true, right? But it's not quite at the level of theory. Okay, so we might talk about the hypothesis of why the dinosaurs went extinct, and the story goes a little something like this. When that crater hit the earth, it was so large and it hit so hard that it essentially caused explosions similar to like nuclear warfare, right? So incredible amount of energy was generated from this impact. And so we're talking about, explosions, right? Massive fires, even on the opposite side of the globe, right, was going to be tremendously impacted by this impact. Because when you have fires to that extent, right, that just burn and burn and burn and burn and burn and burn because they have so much energy, you have so much smoke that it fills the sky and you can't see the sun anymore, right? All that ash changes the pH of the oceans. Like, we are talking about like a worldwide apocalyptic situation. Okay. Some critters survived that, like our mammal ancestors. Okay. But a lot of things didn't, right? So there were lots of different types of plants that went extinct at that time. There was, lots of dinosaurs that went extinct at that time. Notice I didn't say all dinosaurs, because not all dinosaurs have gone extinct. I'm just gonna put that right there. We'll come back to that later. Okay. So, right. So, yeah. Okay. So these boundaries represent typically big extinction. So extinction is happening here. And then after the extinction, usually we have a big radiation. And what we mean by that is we end up with all kinds of new species. So a whole bunch of stuff dies, and then that opens up spaces for other organisms to live in. Okay, so this is another one of those ways that evolution and ecology tie together, which is why we cover ecology next. Okay, all right, so there's that, right? I'd be happy to talk more about this if you want to. It's pretty entertaining, right? So mass extinction event, and we'll talk more about adaptive radiation later. So for now, don't worry about the rest of this. Here's a little diagram that shows extinctions, right? And sort of how severe they were. So that extinction that I was just telling you about is this one, right? Actually, as far as great extinctions goes, yeah, it's kind of average as far as mass extinctions. The biggest one, the Great Dying, happened 250 million years ago, and that was way worse, but it wasn't as cool. It wasn't about dinosaurs dying, so people don't pay any attention to that. Okay, so the Great Dying was this one, right? And way more, right in there, right around 250. Okay. That is when the most organisms went extinct. Okay. Right. So, and there's background there's background extinctions that happen all the time. A lot of people talk about how we're currently entering the sixth mass extinction because of human behavior. We're losing a lot of species, right? And we're going to get into that a little bit when we talk about all kinds of ecological topics, right? Talk about the effect that humans have on the planet. Okay, so so we'll talk a bit about the sixth mass extinction, right? Anyway, okay. So that's my story about fossils. Okay, so our first line of evidence of evolution, of macroevolution, right, is fossil record. Okay, second line of evidence is biogeography. Okay, let's break down that word, biogeography. So bio, means life. Geography means like location. Okay, and so So why are we looking at a picture of Australia and all of these cute little marsupials? So marsupials are mammals that have pouches. And while they are pregnant, the females are pregnant for a period of time with their babies inside of their uterus. Their gestation time is very, very short. And the babies are actually born, and they're still like embryos. They're still like, that doesn't look like a koala. That looks like a weird shrimp or something, right? Like they're not ready for prime time when they're born. Not like placental mammals, which is what we are. Okay, so a baby's born. Sure, they look like aliens, but it looks like a human, sort of. It's alienish human, right? Whereas like a koala baby, when it's first born, doesn't look like it looks like a pink worm. Okay, so then the babies latch onto a nipple inside of mama's pouch, and they finish their development there. Okay. Being a marsupial is not necessarily ideal. It's a lot safer for your babies if they are protected inside of your body than if they're outside of your body, right? They can fall out of a pouch easier than they can fall out of mom's uterus. Okay, and I can tell you all about that if you want to hear about that, right? So there aren't very many marsupials in most parts of the world, except for Australia. Australia has crap tons of marsupials. Why would that be? I'm gonna tell you. I feel like this section is all like history. I'm gonna tell you a story about the past. Okay, so we'll come back to that. So you all know, I'm not, once again, this is another thing I'm not going to belabor too much because I know you know about this, being that you live in Southern California. Okay, so turns out that the continents move around, right? And it's slow, right? But the continents are located on these plates of the Earth's crust, and they, in some parts of the globe, are separating from each other, and in other parts of the globe, they are kind of getting mashed together. Sometimes the plates are sliding past each other, okay? And anywhere where you have the edge of a plate, there's opportunities for geologic activity, like volcanoes, okay? Now, lucky for us, or not lucky, I don't know, we live next to the edge of a plate, like literally. I'm in my backyard and I'm pointing. Which way am I pointing? That's northeast. Northeast of me, if I just drive northeast for a little bit, right, I will see the San Andreas Fault. It's right there. it's right over there, right? You can see it. You're driving up the freeway and all of a sudden it's like, what's that weird, like jagged, like, right? That's the San Andreas Fault, okay? So essentially you live right here on this edge of a plate. And when we have earthquakes, what's happening is the plates have been pushing up against each other and pushing and building pressure, and then they slip, shake, 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 slip, right? Okay. I know you're thinking, what does this have to do with marsupials? Come back to the marsupials. Here's another picture of the, this is a different area of the San Andreas Fault. This is not a local picture, right? But yeah, you live here. You live like right there. Okay, so, okay. What does that have to do with anything? All right, these moving plates are the reason that Australia has a lot of marsupials and other places don't have as many. Okay, so let's go back in time. Go back. That was me making a back in time sound. Okay, so 100 million years ago. The thing about plate tectonics, right, is that the continents crash together and they separate, and they crash and then they separate, right? And it's been going on for all of Earth's history, okay? So about 100 million years ago, based on the rate that the plates are moving now, we can figure out, you know, where they would have been 100 million years ago based on the sort of direction that they're moving and how fast they're moving. It's about 100 million years ago, all the continents were kind of clumped together into this big landmass that we called Pangea, okay? And then over the course of, you know, of the next 100 million years until now, those chunks of crust, those plates, have been kind of separating from each other, okay? And we can tell that this has happened in a variety of different ways. First of all, we can actually measure the movements of the plates. But second of all, you can see how the continents fit together like puzzle pieces, right? Like, duh, South America and Africa were once connected because they have that like little shape where it's like, duh. Okay. So we have this big, huge landmass. Okay. While we were all connected, the very first mammals, which were not the very first, but early mammals, which were marsupials, evolved. Okay. Now, Australia, of the continents, Australia broke off and went its own way before everybody else. Okay. So it kind of separated around 50 million years ago from everybody else, from all the other continents. Okay. Whereas the other continents were connected at least partially, right? So North America and Europe were still connected. And then, you know, South America and, you know, Antarctica are sort of connected, and right. So, and of course, because Africa is still connected to Europe and Asia, right? So Australia kind of boned out first. They were the first ones to leave the party, right? Well, after Australia left, a new way of being a mammal happened, and that's having a placenta, which means that you are able to, if you're a mama mammal, you're able to keep your young inside of your body much longer until they are much better developed. So no pouch, right? Your babies are born when they're much more just like ready for the outside world. Okay. So in most places in the world, all the marsupials got replaced by placental mammals because it was a better way of doing things. But that characteristic never evolved in Australia. And because Australia was isolated, right, until humans, you know, started screwing around and Europeans started bringing stuff, right? Until people started bringing things to Australia, it was, you know, it was all of the mammals were marsupials there. Some things have gone extinct, right? They're no longer around. Many of the marsupials that are in Australia they're endangered because there are so few of them left because of human activity, right? But what's kind of interesting is that they had or still have marsupials that play similar roles to placental mammals in other places, right? So they've since gone extinct, but this is the picture of the last known Tasmanian wolf, which was a wolf-like thing that was a marsupial, right? And sugar gliders, you know, some people have them as pets. They're illegal in California, but that doesn't stop people. Sugar gliders serve the same kind of ecological role as like a squirrel does, right? And so, you know, kangaroos are essentially, they serve a similar kind of role as like deer. They're herbivores. They're large herbivores that just kind of wander around and eat plants. Yeah. And so even though they look really different from a deer, they have the same kind of, the way they fit into the ecosystem is the same. Right? And so Australia still has these critters, which in many ways are considered like ancient, right? Because Australia has been separated. So this is biogeography because we're looking at the location of life, right? This gives us a clue. The fact that, you know, Australia is separate from the rest of us gives us a clue that, oh, marsupials evolved before other types of mammals, right? You can look at distributions of other types of organisms, and that tells you a story too. So all of these little triangles show where this really kind of interesting particular type of ancient fish called a lungfish, where fossils are found. And so once again, that tells us, that's another kind of part of the story that says, hey, once upon a time, there was not an ocean here, right? At least not a big one, right? We were all connected, right? North America was connected to Europe. South America was connected to Africa. And, you know, all the northern continents were attached to the southern ones. We were all one big happy Pangea, okay? All right, so that's the third. Nope, that was the second. I can't count. 2. Oh, 2. Why are you being a jerk? Is it because did I click the button? You guys, I'm like, I don't want to say I'm high because that sends the wrong message. But I broke out in hives today. and because I have some weird allergies, and I had to take Benadryl, and so I should have put the I wanted to put the 2 on the previous slide. I wanted to put the 2 there. Anyway, so I'm a little extra wonky. I'm wonkier than usual this evening. That's also why I'm not doing these until this evening. I was planning on doing this morning, but I had a day, you guys. It was like nothing like epically bad happened. It was just a bunch of little bad things. It's one of those. Anyway, sorry. Okay, so fossil record is one sort of body of evidence. Biogeography is the second large body of evidence. The third is comparative anatomy. So comparative anatomy is exactly what it sounds like. We're comparing body parts of different organisms. And it, I hope it goes without saying that the more similar structures are, it's more likely that they're going to be due to shared ancestry. Okay. So what we're looking at in this image is we are looking at the forelimbs, so the arm or the front limb of, in this particular case, we're looking at 3 different mammals. So here's a human, right? Shoulder blade, big upper arm bone. It's called the humerus. You don't know that. 2 long, skinny arm bones. That's right here. So humerus, radius, and ulna are there. Here's your wee little wrist bones, and then there's your hand bones. Okay. All right, let's look at some other mammals, shall we? Oh, look, here's the shoulder blade of a porpoise. Here's the humerus of a porpoise. Here's the radius and ulna. Here's the wrist bones. Here's the hand bones. Now, the details are different, right? So a porpoise has a flipper instead of an arm. So their bones, instead of being like long and skinny, they're stouter and shorter because they're using theirs for like getting through water. So they're tougher, whereas we use ours for gesticulating wildly and carrying things, right? So the purpose of our, the way that we use our forelimbs is different. So the details are different, but the basic layout is the same, right? So even our bat, now this leaves off the scapula is missing, but humerus, radius, ulna, little wrist bones, finger bones, hand bones, right? And they use theirs for flying. Okay, so that's comparative anatomy, right? So you can look at 2 organisms that are alive now, and you can just look at their anatomy and kind of go, all right, what's similar, what's different, how similar are things? Yeah. Okay, so the term that we use to describe those kinds of structures that are the same as a result of common ancestry, so we call those homologous structures, or we call them homologies. Okay, so homologous structures, right, or homologies. I lost my S. Okay, and what these are is structures that are similar. So structures similar as a result of common ancestry, meaning that the reason that we have this arrangement of bones in our arms is a result of the fact that our ancestors had that, and their ancestors had that, and their ancestors had that. And if you look at basically any mammal, right, all mammals have that arrangement. And in fact, the vast majority of birds and reptiles do too. And for that matter, amphibians as well. And it's not until we start to get to fish that we start to lose that, right? And so you can sort of see how closely related different species are by seeing how many homologous structures do they share, right? How many structural similarities are there, okay? And this even extends to embryology. So comparative embryology essentially is just comparative anatomy of embryos. So what the heck is an embryo? An embryo is a not fully developed organism, okay? So when in mammals, right? So let's talk about people. The first 9 weeks of gestation, right? That little multi-celled creature that's growing inside of you is an embryo. And then after it reaches a certain state, right, a certain, you know, level of development, then we call it a fetus, right? And then ultimately, once that fetus is born, now we call it an infant. Okay, so that's the terminology we use. Basically, you know, the idea is that embryos are kind of the earliest developmental stages, right? And the more developed it gets, right, ultimately, you know, you go by a different name describing what that thing is. Okay, so if we look at embryos of different organisms, we can see that often organisms have really interesting shared anatomy as embryos that they don't have as adults. Okay, so for example, did you know that when you were an embryo, all of you, when you were an embryo, you actually had these little pouches on the side of your neck, very much like the gills of a fish. Now, you weren't using them the same way, right? In fact, in you weren't using them for anything. Eventually, they turned into parts of your jaw and parts of your middle ear, so the bones in your ear, right, came from those sort of pouches in your neck. But in fish, those pouches become gills, right? So you had, at some point in your life, you had the precursor to gills, okay? Another interesting one is you had a tail, right? When you were an embryo, you had a tail, and you still have a tail, but you know, 3 to 5 bones, it's tiny, right? But once upon a time, you had a tail that was multiple bones, right? That died and, you know, kind of disappeared. And so one of the things that's really interesting about looking at embryology is you can see structures that sometimes disappear as an organism develops, right? So here we're looking at a chicken and a human. And what's interesting is that neither one of these organisms have gills as adults, right? Chickens have tails, but chicken tails are that big, right? Humans don't have, typically, we don't have a tail that protrudes out of our body, right? It's our tailbone is small enough that it usually does not protrude, although, you know, stuff happens, right? And so here we're looking at a human and we're pointing out those same things, those pouches that become gills in a fish, but in a turtle, a human, or a chicken, they become parts of the ear and parts of the jaw, right? And then that tail, yeah, which turtles also have tails. Once again, they're real stumpy little thing. So chickens and turtles have stumpy little tails. Humans, the vast majority of the time, don't have a tail at all. Okay, so we're just comparing homologous structures in embryos now instead of in adults. Okay, one thing you have to watch out for. So I'm gonna pause for a second, and I'm gonna have you should pause, think about what's the definition of a homology again? What does it mean when we say that two structures are homologous structures? I'll let you. Okay, good. You looked it up from the last slide, hopefully, right? Or in your notes, or you rewound the video or something. Okay, what is an analogous structure? Okay, so whereas a homologous structure or homologies have similarity due to common ancestry, right? Analogous structures, or when you have structures that are similar, usually in a more superficial kind of a way, because they have similarity in their function, but it's not necessarily as, like I said, it's more superficial, Okay, it's much more superficial similarity generally, and it's not due to common ancestry. Okay, so we are looking at an example here with a bat, a mammal, a puffin, which is a type of bird, and a fly, a housefly. Okay, so we already have looked at bat limbs, right? So remember, they got the one bone, the two skinny bones, bunch of little teeny tiny bones, and then fingers. Okay, well, our puffin has that too. One bone, two skinny bones. The wrist kind of, it's a little, So it's getting more different the farther we go, but the basic layout is the same, right? This whole one, two smaller things, right? Okay, how about our fly? Do flies have bones? They don't have bones at all. And yet they have wings. So all three of these animals have wings. They have structures that they use for flying. Which wings are homologous structures? Which wings are analogous structures? Okay, so if we look at these three organisms, two of them, their similarity is due to common ancestry. So which are the two that are homologous structures? Think about the theme music to Jeopardy. Do, 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 do. You know, I have a friend who was on Jeopardy once. Yeah, real smart guy. Weird. I went to prom with him. It wasn't like that. He's gay, as it turns out. Didn't know that at the time. We had fun though. We actually like danced, and it was a good time. Anyway, he's super important. He's like the director of like nuclear non-proliferation. He was under Obama. He's like, it's weird. It's like, it's a really good way to give you a complex and makes you feel like you haven't succeeded at anything in life when your prom date is like, rubbing elbows with the president. Whatever. Gosh, see, it's the Benadryl talking. It's the Benadryl. Where was I? So I don't know that he would even know this though. Science isn't really his thing. He's like an economics kind of guy. Anyway, so that was the one subject I was better than him in school, was science. So our bat wing and our puffin wing are both due to common ancestry. They're both made of bones and muscles and skin. Now, puffins also have feathers and other stuff, and the shapes of the bones are different, but it's ultimately the same like architecture, right? Whereas our fly, those wings are made of something completely different. They are only made of exoskeleton. Exoskeleton isn't even a thing in the other animals, right? Flies don't have bones. Flies have muscles, kind of, but they're not the same as ours, right? So these wings compared to these two, to the other two, are analogous. So similarity in function, but not due to common ancestry. So the puffin wing and the fly wing, analogous. The bat wing and the fly wing, analogous. The bat wing and the puffin wing, homologous. Yeah? Okay. Sometimes it's really hard to tell. Right? And so we've been able to figure out a lot about the history of life by looking at homologous structures. But sometimes it's not that easy to do. And sometimes it's really confusing. So in these two plants, they both have pokey things on their stems, right? Now, I've taken a lot of biology in my time. So I know, I can tell just by looking at them, because nerd, right? I can tell that the actual like anatomical structure of those, right? Those are actually spines, whereas these are something that botanically we call a prickle, right? Because it has a different like tissue origin, okay? Don't worry about that. But the punchline is this. Sometimes you see structures that you think are homologous because it's like, yeah, that looks really similar, but they're actually not. So these two species are not particularly closely related, even though superficially they really look like they are, okay? Okay, so comparative anatomy can be a useful tool, not always the best tool. Often we start to see analogous structures as a result of something called convergent evolution. So convergent evolution is essentially this idea that some sort of characteristic is so useful that it evolves more than once. So flight evolved in insects completely independently from flight evolving in mammals, right? It happened. In fact, there are other organisms that evolved flight as well, right? It has evolved multiple times, right, in, you know, the history of life. So that's kind of interesting. Okay. All right. So that's called convergent evolution. I'm not super uptight on you knowing that term. Okay. Number 4. Oh, God, I've been talking forever. I am so long-winded, y'all. I hope y'all are speeding through these or something, taking breaks, because I'm tired of hearing myself talk. Okay. 4th area of evidence, fourth line of evidence for evolution. Nowadays, we call this bioinformatics. Essentially, what we're looking at, though, is we're looking at genetic similarities. This is like the youngest evidence. All of those other things, the first 3, are all things that we've been looking at for, you know, theoretically, a couple hundred years, right? So we have a ton of evidence for all of those things that's old, quite frankly, right? Some of it we've known for a very long time. Bioinformatics is relatively new, though. We're talking about, you know, in the last 20 to 30 years is when these techniques, these biotech techniques have allowed us to really look at not just physical structures in organisms, but look at genetic similarities. So compare genes, right? Compare DNA, compare proteins that are made in the body, which we'll talk more about what a protein is later, right? And so we can look at comparing DNA sequences. So if we look at, okay, we're going to look at the gene for some specific thing in a bunch of different primates, and we're going to see how similar they are to each other. Well, that tells you how closely related they are. Okay, so bioinformatics is really, really interesting because if we have a feel for how quickly mutations occur, changes in DNA, we can have a estimate of, right, how long ago did a couple of species share a common ancestor. Okay, one of the other little video clips I'm going to have you guys watch this week that's not me talking is somebody who talks about, you know, we're taught evolution wrong, right? And he talks about, if humans came from monkeys, why are there still monkeys, right? And all that business. And he explains it in such an elegant way that I was like, yes, they need to watch it. It's only like 6 minutes, that video. It's real short. But he really helps you kind of create this idea of what does it mean to be to have a common ancestor, right? And what does that look like in the family tree? Okay, so you're gonna want to watch that. All right. So how much more do I want to say? Okay, so to wrap up our evidence for macroevolution, those were the 4 main things. So say it with me again. Number 1 was fossils. Number 2 was biogeography. Number 3 was comparative anatomy. Number 4, bioinformatics, or, you know, comparative genes. I don't know. Okay, those are the 4 things. All right, one last little thing I want to talk about, and then we're gonna take a break and we're gonna have a different video. Okay, so before we move to a different topic, right? One other thing that's kind of interesting is this idea of, is evolution branching or non-branching, right? So sometimes a population of some organism or species, right, undergoes gradual change over time, right? So in this little made up example, we've got this butterfly that is ancestral, right? So from the past, and, you know, that population accumulated changes over time, and now we have something that looks different, and we probably call it a different species. Okay, So that's non-branching evolution. This essentially came from this, okay? On the other hand, there's also something called branching evolution. Branching evolution is when you have this situation where you have a species and the population or populations of that species diverge over time and they gradually accumulate differences so that what you end up with is 2 or more different species. Okay, now I'll leave this video with a little thought question. Okay, both of these types of evolution have happened and are continuing to happen, right? We know for sure, though, that one of them happens quite a bit. What do I want to say for my hint? And the reason that we know that is based on the number of species that exist on this planet. So if you go back to the organism of the day video, when we did the first organism of the day, not of the day, of the week, the organism of the week video, where I was talking about all kinds of things, right? If you go back to that video, right, there are estimates that there's about 10 million species on this planet, right? Well, there's got to be a lot of branching evolution happening to get up to 10 million. Otherwise, we'd only have one species. If all evolution was non-branching, we would have started with one species and we'd still be at one species, right? So while non-branching evolution does occur, certainly it occurs, there's also a lot of branching evolution. Okay, so we're going to stop here and then we're going to have another video about speciation, what a species is actually, sort of a definition of what a species is, and then some conversation about how we, yeah, okay, I got to go get more water, so we'll stop.